There's probably a person you can think of right now without even trying. You might not talk to them anymore. Maybe you haven't seen them in months. Maybe you see them every day, but things aren't the same anymore. Maybe nothing even happened between you two. And somehow, despite all the time that has passed, they still cross your mind. You can be doing something completely unrelated and suddenly a memory appears. A song reminds you of them. A place reminds you of something that happened. You see someone wearing the same hoodie they used to wear, or you hear a phrase they used to say, and for a second it feels like you're back in that moment again. Then you wonder why. Why does this person still have a place in your mind when they aren't even part of your life anymore? The strange thing about memories is that they don't always disappear just because someone leaves. Time can create distance, but distance doesn't automatically erase emotion, and sometimes the person you can't forget isn't even the person you actually miss. You might miss who you were when you were around them. You might miss the way life felt during that period. You might miss having something to look forward to. You might miss the excitement, the conversations, the possibility of something happening. Sometimes you aren't holding on to a person. You're holding on to a feeling. That's what makes this so difficult to understand. If someone was never actually yours, why can losing the possibility of them feel like losing something real? If you were never together, why can you still feel like something ended? If you barely knew them, why can they still take up so much space in your thoughts? The answer is that your brain doesn't only remember what actually happened, it also remembers what could have happened, and sometimes the possibilities are harder to let go of than reality. Think about it. If something ends clearly, you usually know what happened. You know why it ended. You know what the final conversation was. You know there isn't much left to wonder about. But when something never really gets a chance to begin, there can be hundreds of unanswered questions. What if you had said something? What if you had asked them out? What if they felt the same way? What if you had stayed friends? What if you had made a different decision? What if you had met at a different time? Those questions can keep a person alive in your mind long after they have left your everyday life, and that's one of the biggest reasons people struggle to forget someone. Your brain doesn't like unfinished stories. It wants an ending. When there isn't one, it keeps going back to the same chapter, trying to figure out what it missed. You replay conversations, you analyze small details, you remember the way they looked at you or something they said months ago. You start wondering whether something meant more than you originally thought, and every time you think you finally moved on, another memory appears and pulls you back. But here's something important. Remembering someone doesn't mean you need them back. Missing someone doesn't automatically mean they were the right person for you. Thinking about someone doesn't mean you should contact them. Sometimes a person can be important to your story without being part of your future. That's a difficult idea to accept, especially when your emotions are telling you otherwise, because emotions don't always care about logic. You can know that something is over and still feel attached to it. You can know that someone wasn't perfect and still remember the good parts. You can know that moving forward is the right thing to do and still wish things had turned out differently. That's normal. Moving on isn't about convincing yourself that you never cared. It's about accepting that you did care, accepting that it mattered, and then understanding that something being meaningful doesn't mean it has to last forever. The person you can't forget might have changed you without ever realizing it. Maybe they made you more confident, maybe they taught you what you wanted in another person, maybe they showed you what you didn't want, maybe they pushed you to become more social, maybe they gave you memories you'll carry for years, and maybe their biggest impact on your life wasn't that they stayed. Maybe it was that they helped you become the person you are now. So if someone still crosses your mind, don't immediately treat that as a problem you need to solve. You don't have to erase every memory, you don't have to pretend you don't care, and you definitely don't have to force yourself to forget. The goal isn't to wake up one morning and suddenly feel nothing. The goal is to reach a point where remembering them doesn't control what you do next, because eventually the memory can stay while the pain fades. You can remember someone and simply think, that was an important part of my life. You can remember the conversations, the jokes, the moments, and the things you wished had happened without needing to return to them. And when that happens, you'll realize something important. Forgetting someone was never the real goal. The goal was becoming okay with the fact that they are no longer part of your life. One of the hardest things about missing someone is figuring out exactly what you're missing. Because sometimes you think you miss the person, when really you miss the feeling they gave you. You miss waking up and having someone to think about. You miss checking your phone and hoping their name appears. You miss having a reason to get excited about seeing someone. You miss the version of yourself that felt more confident, more energetic, or more hopeful when they were around. This is why memories can be so powerful. Your brain doesn't store every moment equally. It tends to hold on to moments that had strong emotions attached to them. That's why one 5-minute conversation can stay in your head longer than an entire ordinary day. It isn't necessarily because the conversation was objectively important, it's because it meant something to you. Maybe you remember the first time you really noticed them. Maybe you remember a joke that made you laugh. Maybe you remember walking home after talking to them. Maybe you remember sitting somewhere and realizing that you actually cared about what they thought of you. Those moments can become almost like snapshots in your mind. And because they're snapshots, they're incomplete. You remember the best parts, you remember the excitement, you remember the feeling. What you don't always remember is everything around those moments. You might forget the times they ignored you. You might forget the conversations that weren't interesting. You might forget the things you didn't actually have in common. You might forget how uncertain you felt. Your brain can turn a complicated person into a collection of your favorite memories. That's where idealization starts. You create a version of the person in your head that might not even be completely real. They're always funny in your memories, they're always interesting, they're always kind. Every conversation seems meaningful, every interaction seems like it had some deeper purpose. You remember the best version of them because that's the version your emotions want to remember. And once that happens, you're no longer comparing reality to reality. You're comparing your current life to a highlight reel. That's an impossible competition. Your current life has boring days, awkward moments, stress, school responsibilities, and random problems. But the person in your memory doesn't have any of that. They only exist in the moments you chose to remember. Of course, that version of them feels special. This is why sometimes meeting someone again after a long time can feel strange. You might have spent months imagining how incredible it would be to see them again, only to realize that the real person doesn't match the version you built in your head. They changed, you changed, the situation changed, and suddenly you realize that what you were missing wasn't necessarily them, you were missing a moment in time. There's nothing wrong with that. You are allowed to miss a time in your life. You are allowed to miss how you felt. You are allowed to remember something and wish you could experience it again. But you also have to understand that going backward isn't always the answer. Sometimes the reason you want someone back is because you want to feel the way you felt when they were around. And the good news is that feelings aren't exclusive to one person. The excitement you felt can happen again. The confidence you gained can come back. The happiness you experienced can exist in a different chapter with different people. You don't have to recreate the exact same story to experience something meaningful again. That's something people often forget. They think there was one perfect person, one perfect moment, one perfect opportunity, and if they lose it, nothing will ever compare. But life doesn't work like that. You can have meaningful friendships with people you haven't even met yet. You can experience moments you couldn't imagine today. You can become a version of yourself that would barely recognize the person who was so attached to that old memory. And sometimes that's exactly what moving forward looks like. You stop asking, how do I get that person back? And start asking, what was it about that time that made me so happy? And how can I create more of that in my life? Maybe you need more friends. Maybe you need to get out of your room more. Maybe you need to try something new. Maybe you need to start creating something. Maybe you need to meet people who actually appreciate you. Maybe you simply need to give yourself permission to experience something new instead of constantly comparing everything to what happened before. Because if you spend all your time looking backward, you'll eventually miss the people who are standing in front of you. The person you can't forget might have been amazing. They might have been important, they might have changed you, but that doesn't mean they were the last person who could ever make you feel that way. There are still people you haven't met, places you haven't been, memories you haven't created, conversations you haven't had. And one day, something that feels impossible to imagine right now might become the memory you look back on and wonder how you ever lived without it. There is a word that can keep someone trapped for years. What if? What if I had told them how I felt? What if I had tried harder? What if I hadn't made that mistake? What if they actually liked me? What if we had met at a different time? What if I had said something different? What if I had never walked away? The problem with what if is that it creates a version of reality where everything works out perfectly. You can imagine the conversation going exactly how you wanted. You can imagine them saying yes. You can imagine the relationship you could have had. You can imagine every part of the story without ever having to experience the difficult parts. And because that imaginary version has no flaws, it can become more appealing than reality. But here's the truth about every what if. You'll never know. That's one of the hardest things about life. We don't get to see the alternate versions of our decisions. Every decision closes some doors while opening others. You choose one school, one friend group, one opportunity, one path, and you never get to experience all the paths you didn't take. That doesn't mean you made the wrong decision, it means you're human. You can spend years wondering what would have happened if you had done something differently, but you'll never receive a perfect answer. And eventually, you have to decide whether you want to spend your life investigating a past you can't change or building a future you actually can. Imagine someone standing at a crossroads staring at the road behind them. They keep thinking about the path they didn't take. They wonder where it would have led. They imagine the places they might have seen and the people they might have met, but while they are looking backward, they aren't moving forward on the road they're actually standing on. That's what if can do to you. It makes the past feel like a place you can still reach. You can't. You can learn from it. You can understand it. You can appreciate it, but you can't return to it and change the decisions you made. Maybe you should have said something. Maybe you should have taken the chance. Maybe you should have apologized. Maybe you should have stayed. Maybe you should have left sooner. There are probably things you could have done differently, that's true for everyone, but knowing that doesn't mean you have to punish yourself forever. You are making decisions with the information and confidence you had at the time. The person you are today knows things that the person you were back then didn't know. That's why it's so easy to judge your past self. You have information now that you didn't have then. Instead of asking, why didn't I do it? Ask, what can I do differently next time? That's where regret becomes useful. Maybe you missed your chance with someone. Okay, what did that teach you? Did you learn that you should communicate more honestly? Did you learn that you shouldn't wait forever? Did you learn that you need to stop assuming you know what someone else is thinking? Did you learn that you need to take more chances? If you learned something, then the experience wasn't completely wasted. The next person you meet doesn't have to suffer because you were afraid with the last person. The next opportunity doesn't have to disappear because you were hesitant before. Your past can become preparation instead of a prison. And there's another side to what if that people don't talk about. What if it wouldn't have worked? What if you had asked and they said no? What if you had dated and realized you weren't compatible? What if the person you imagined was completely different from the person you actually got to know? What if the relationship you thought would change your life ended up teaching you something painful instead? We rarely imagine those possibilities because they aren't as exciting. That's why you can't use an imaginary future as proof that someone was perfect for you. You don't know what would have happened, and that's okay. Sometimes you don't need the answer. Sometimes you just need to accept that the story ended differently than you hoped. The person you can't forget may represent a road you never took, but there are still roads ahead of you, and unlike the road behind you, those are roads you can actually choose. So when your mind asks, what if? Try answering with something different. What now? What can you do now? Who can you become now? Who can you meet now? What opportunity can you take now? Because the past has already happened, the future hasn't, and that's where your power is. Sometimes moving on becomes difficult because you don't actually get a clean ending. Maybe you still see the person at school. Maybe you have mutual friends. Maybe they're still on your social media. Maybe their name occasionally appears on your screen. You can go weeks without thinking about them, and then suddenly you see them again and it feels like all the progress disappeared. It can be confusing. You might think, I thought I was over this. But feeling something again doesn't mean you've gone backward. Imagine you're walking through a neighborhood you haven't visited in years. You pass a house and suddenly remember something that happened there when you were younger. The memory can feel incredibly vivid, but that doesn't mean you're back in that moment. You're still standing in the present. Your brain simply recognized something connected to the past. The same thing happens with people. Seeing them can activate memories that you've barely thought about in months. Suddenly you remember the conversations, the jokes, the feelings, the things you wanted to say. For a moment, it can feel like you're right back where you started. But you're not. You've changed. And that's something you might not notice until you're tested by an old memory. Maybe the first time you saw them after everything happened, you couldn't stop thinking about it for the rest of the day. Months later, you see them again and you're okay by the evening. That's progress. Maybe you used to check their profile constantly. Now you don't even think about it. That's progress. Maybe you used to imagine conversations with them every night. Now you only remember them occasionally. That's progress. Moving on doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's just noticing that something that used to consume you now takes up 5 minutes of your day instead of 5 hours. You don't need to hate someone to move on from them. That's another misconception. People sometimes think the only way to stop caring is to convince themselves that the other person was terrible, but you don't have to do that. You can think someone is a good person and still accept that they aren't right for your life. You can appreciate the memories and still leave them in the past. You can wish someone well without wanting them back. That's maturity. And if you see them with someone else, that can be especially difficult. You might immediately start comparing yourself. You might wonder what that person has that you don't. You might convince yourself that the other person is better, funnier, more attractive, more confident, or somehow more deserving. But someone choosing another person isn't a measurement of your value. People have preferences. People have different personalities. People connect differently. Sometimes two good people simply aren't right for each other. You don't need to become a different person just because someone didn't choose you. You should grow. But grow because you want to become better for yourself, not because you're trying to prove something to someone who walked away. That's an important difference. There is a version of self-improvement that comes from insecurity. It says, I'll become successful so they'll regret losing me. But there's a healthier version. I want to become successful because I want to see what I'm capable of. The second one lasts longer. Because if you build your entire future around making one person regret their decision, you're still allowing them to control your life. Real growth happens when you stop needing them to notice. You start working on yourself even if they'll never see the result. You become more confident even if they'll never hear about it. You achieve your goals without needing their approval. And eventually something strange happens. You realize you don't actually care whether they notice. That's freedom. The person you can't forget doesn't have to become the person you spend your life trying to impress. They can simply become someone who was part of your story, and when you eventually look back, you might be grateful for what that chapter taught you, even if you wouldn't choose to relive it. Maybe you've been trying too hard to forget. Every time they enter your mind, you immediately try to push the thought away. You tell yourself you shouldn't care anymore. You get frustrated because you thought you had moved on. You wonder why you still remember something that happened so long ago. But trying to force yourself to forget someone can actually make the memory feel more important. It's like telling yourself, don't think about this. Now you're thinking about it. The healthier approach isn't to fight every memory, it's to let it exist without giving it control. If you remember them, remember them. You don't have to follow the thought for an hour, you don't have to start looking through old pictures, you don't have to check their social media, you don't have to imagine what they're doing. You can simply recognize the memory and continue with your day. At first, that might feel impossible. But eventually, your brain learns that the memory doesn't require a reaction. That's when things start changing. A memory can exist without becoming an emotional emergency. You might hear their name and not feel your stomach drop. You might see an old picture and smile instead of feeling sad. You might remember something funny and actually appreciate it instead of wishing you could go back. That is what moving forward can look like. Not forgetting, accepting. There's also something beautiful about realizing that you don't have to erase parts of your past to become someone new. Your memories are part of you. The people you've met are part of your story. The mistakes you've made are part of your story. The things that didn't work out are part of your story. You don't need to pretend they never happened. You just need to make sure they don't write the rest of the story for you. Maybe that person taught you how much you care about connection. Maybe they showed you that you want someone who communicates openly. Maybe they made you realize you need to be more confident. Maybe they helped you understand what kind of person you want to become. Take those lessons, leave the rest. Because every chapter doesn't have to continue forever to have been meaningful. Think about a movie you love. You don't expect every character to remain on screen for the entire movie. Some characters appear for a short time, change the main character, and leave. Their role is still important even after they're gone. Real life can be like that. Someone can enter your life for a short period and still leave a permanent lesson behind. That doesn't mean you were supposed to stay together forever. It means the experience mattered, and sometimes that's enough. One of the biggest signs that you're moving on is when you stop needing the story to have a different ending. You stop imagining the perfect conversation. You stop wondering whether they secretly think about you. You stop trying to figure out what could have happened. You accept what happened. Not because you love the ending, because you understand that you can't rewrite it, and once you stop trying to rewrite the past, you finally have energy to write something new. That's the part people miss. Moving on isn't just about losing something, it's about making space for new friends, new experiences, new goals, new memories. Maybe one day you'll meet someone who makes you realize why the previous situation never worked. Maybe you'll make a friend who becomes more important to you than you could have imagined. Maybe you'll discover a hobby that changes your life. Maybe you'll start a project that leads somewhere unexpected. You don't know. And that's exciting, because the future hasn't been written yet. The person you can't forget belongs to a chapter that already exists. The next chapter is still empty. Sometimes we spend so much time asking whether someone was meant to stay that we forget to ask what they were meant to teach us. Maybe the lesson was confidence, maybe it was communication, maybe it was realizing that you shouldn't settle for someone who doesn't appreciate you. Maybe it was learning that you need to take chances. Maybe it was discovering that you care more deeply than you thought. Whatever the lesson was, you don't have to keep the person to keep what you learned. That's an important distinction. Imagine someone teaches you how to ride a bike. Eventually, you don't need that person standing next to you every time you ride. The lesson stays even when the teacher leaves. Relationships and friendships can work the same way. Someone can teach you something about yourself and then move out of your life. You don't have to chase them to prove that the lesson mattered. And sometimes the lesson isn't even about relationships. Maybe you became more social because of them. Maybe you started taking better care of yourself. Maybe you became more confident. Maybe you started making videos. Maybe you started working toward a goal because you wanted to become someone you were proud of. If a person indirectly pushed you toward becoming a better version of yourself, their impact doesn't disappear just because they aren't around anymore. But there is one important warning. Don't make someone the reason for everything you do. It's okay if they inspired you, but eventually your motivation needs to become your own. If you started improving yourself because you wanted them to notice, that's understandable, but at some point you need to decide that you're doing it for you. Because imagine reaching your biggest goal and immediately looking around to see whether that person noticed. You would still be giving them control. Real success is reaching that goal and being proud even if they never hear about it. That's when you know you've moved forward. The same applies to relationships. You don't need to find another person immediately just to fill the empty space someone left. Being alone for a while isn't failure. It can actually be one of the most useful periods of your life. You learn what you like, you learn what you don't like, you become comfortable with yourself, you figure out what you want, and when someone new eventually comes along, you aren't asking them to complete you, you're choosing to share your life with them. That's a completely different mindset, because when you're desperate to replace someone, you might accept almost anyone. But when you're comfortable on your own, you can be more selective. You can look for someone who actually respects you, someone who communicates, someone who makes you feel comfortable being yourself, someone who wants to be there, rather than someone you constantly have to convince. That's why sometimes losing someone can create space for something healthier. You don't see it immediately. At first, all you see is what's missing. But later, you might see what the empty space allowed you to build. Maybe you became more confident. Maybe you found better friends. Maybe you started pursuing something you always wanted to do. Maybe you became more independent. Maybe you learned how to communicate instead of staying silent. Maybe you finally started taking chances. And maybe years later, you realized that the person you couldn't forget was important. Just not for the reason you originally thought. They weren't necessarily the person you were supposed to end up with. Maybe they were the person who helped prepare you for the person you eventually became. And that doesn't make the connection meaningless, it makes it part of your growth. One day, you're gonna think about this person and realize something has changed. You won't necessarily forget their name or erase the memories. You'll just realize that you aren't waiting anymore. You're not checking your phone hoping they'll text. You're not replaying every conversation or wondering what could have happened. You're just living your life, and that might be the biggest sign that you've moved on. Not that you forgot them, but that you remembered yourself. You had dreams before you met them. You had friends, interests, goals, and a life that existed without them. They became part of your story, but they were never supposed to become your entire story. So if you're struggling to let someone go, don't make forgetting them the goal. Make living your life the goal. Go outside, talk to your friends, try something new, work towards something you're proud of. Make memories that have nothing to do with that person. Eventually, those new memories start taking up more space than the old ones, and maybe years from now, you'll think about the person you once couldn't forget. Instead of wishing you could go back, you'll simply smile. You'll understand what they taught you, why that chapter mattered, and how much you've changed since then. That's what moving on really is. It's not pretending you never cared. It's not deleting every memory. It's accepting that some people are meant to be chapters, not the entire story. So if there's someone you can't forget right now, don't hate yourself for it. Give yourself time. Keep the good memories, learn from what happened, and let go of what you can't change, because there is still a future ahead of you that you haven't experienced yet. There are people you haven't met, places you haven't seen, and memories that don't exist yet. Don't miss them because you're too busy rereading an old chapter. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe for more, and let me know in the comments if there's something you're trying to move forward from. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.